Good morning, everyone. The last time I spoke on David at church was actually on the topic Stephen was speaking on last week, David the Outlaw. And as part of the talk, I reflected on an evening that I and a few other people from Christchurch had spent listening to the contemporary Christian author and theologian Rob Bell. He was doing a tour to promote his new book at the time called Drops Like Stars, in which he focused on creativity and suffering. And at one point during his talk, he asked everyone to write the words, "I know how you feel," on a piece of card. Rob then asked some human suffering questions like, how many of you have been directly affected by cancer? How many of you have been betrayed? How many of you had a stack of bills that you did not know how you were going to pay them? And with each question, Rob had us make eye contact with someone who had that same type of experience that we had and swap these "I know how you feel" cards with them. It was a really effective way of seeing that we weren't alone in our past and present sufferings and that others had experienced them too. Grief, mourning, is one of the most difficult, challenging, and painful experiences we will likely encounter in our lives. The loss of someone close to us leaves a hole that may never disappear. And we all probably will experience this at some point. We'll all have that shared experience. And it's an experience that we share with King David. But will we share in David's mourning of not just those whom we love, but those whom we regard as our enemy? It's a question that is always going to challenge us, and none more so than on Remembrance Sunday. After Jesus, David is the person about whom there is the most written in the Bible. There's the most content after Jesus to do with David. And so there's so much to be able to learn from him and about how he was a key part of God's plan for salvation. I don't know how much David realized at the time that he was, or that how it would all happen through one of his descendants. But that plan involved everything that happened in David's crazy life. And at this particular moment in time that we're looking at this morning, David is at something of a pivotal transition moment. Prior to this current event that we're looking at, David's life had just been wild. Last week, Stephen looked at David the Outlaw, a time when David had had to flee from Saul, leave his family and life behind, after Saul had made numerous attempts on his life. He ends up battling Philistines, hiding in caves, living in the wilderness. He even has the opportunity twice to end Saul's life, yet he chooses not to. God's plan to bring about salvation involved so many highs and lows for David. But in all things, David shows us what it means to be a man after God's own heart. He trusts God. He converses with God. He doesn't moan and curse God when things go wrong, but instead he calls out to him for help in the difficult times and then gets on with the life that he is living, knowing that whatever may happen, God hears him and God is with him. This is the David who is a man after God's own heart. He trusts the God of Israel so implicitly that having to flee his wife, his home, his city, none of that shakes his faith in God's providence. David had more than one opportunity to kill Saul, as I mentioned, yet he didn't take those opportunities. He chose not to, because he knew that God had anointed Saul as king. Despite all his flaws, that was part of God's plan. Just as it would be to eventually lead David to be king over Judah and Israel and be the ancestor of the promised Messiah. But right now, at this point in the Bible that we're looking at, he's at a kind of a pivotal turning point moment. Saul, the jealous king who had sought to end David's life on multiple occasions, is dead. The source of all of David's trouble and stress and suffering is finally out of the picture. Surely it's a cause for celebration, of thanks and relief. No. Instead, we have this extraordinary, almost unexpected event where David mourns not just the death of his beloved friend and companion Jonathan, but also of Jonathan's father, Saul, the king, who pursued David with a vengeance, all because he was a jealous and insecure king. David laments his loss and seeks the Lord during yet another time of trial. Yet his actions are at first a little strange and unnerving. An Amalekite, an opportunistic Amalekite, brings David the news of Saul and Jonathan's deaths. And just as we might have expected, the Amalekite too assumes that hearing Saul is dead is going to make David happy. He describes how he, the Amalekite, had to end Saul's life as he was mortally wounded. He then takes Saul's crown and regal armband and delivers them to David. Perhaps he might be the first person to honor the new king. But David doesn't take the crown and place it on his head, assuming the position of monarch. No, instead, we hear that David and all his men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. So far removed was David from the exclamation of joy that the Amalekite was expecting to happen, that actually David fell into a passion of weeping. He tore his clothes. He mourned and fasted not only for his people Israel and Jonathan his friend, but for Saul, his enemy. Why? Why was David so grieved by the death of Saul, who wanted him dead? Why did he lament Saul's death and go on to avenge him by having the Amalekite brutally executed? We get the clue where David repeatedly calls Saul the Lord's anointed. God himself put Saul in a position to reign as king, and not even Saul's most heinous acts could override God's will. David's conviction of this truth and his surrender to God's sovereignty was stronger than his own pride and desire to escape unscathed. Because some things are just bigger than us. In Romans chapter 12, Paul's instruction is to bless those who persecute you. And that's exactly what David did. He blessed those who had tried to kill him. And it's a trait that we then see in the man who was known as the Son of David, Jesus. There on the cross, Jesus was mocked, persecuted, hung to die, all under the watch of our wise and sovereign God. And yet what did Jesus do? He had compassion on those who persecuted him. Now, the treatment of the Amalekite being struck down may seem a tad extreme, but what he had done was lie and try to engineer a tragic situation into fortune for himself, because the Amalekite didn't kill Saul. At the end of the book of 1 Samuel, we have the actual account of the death of Saul and his sons. Jonathan and his brothers are killed by the Philistines, and Saul is critically wounded by their archers. In desperation to avoid being abused and humiliated while still clinging to life, he falls on his own sword, choosing to end his life rather than have it ended by his enemies. The Amalekite lied. thinking he could take the credit for this and somehow gain favor with David. He was the one to end the life of the person who had tormented David. But instead, his lies condemn him. He claims to have killed the Lord's anointed, so he therefore is put to death himself. David's heart is in line with God's, and even though Saul, his vicious enemy, is now gone and the threats are finished, David is still saddened that his life and his chance for repentance has passed. And so we come to the second half of chapter 1 in 2 Samuel. We have this song, this poem that David Lothman read to us. It's a poem that King David is moved to compose and write. David may be famous for his conquests in battle, the defeat of Goliath and the Philistines and many other nations, but he is most prolific in his words. Through this composition, he looked to both express his own sorrow for this tragedy, and to impress upon the people that they should take his words to heart also. Music can be a really powerful way to express and process emotions. I grew up as a Christian all my life, and some of my most memorable ways I found myself encountering and worshipping God were in songs of worship, rediscovering old favorites, inspiring words from hundreds of years ago, beautiful modern tunes and melodies in poetic lyrics, every bit as meaningful as anything David wrote, and yet frequently actually inspired directly by what David wrote. Music is a gift from God, bringing us into the presence of God, filling us with the presence of God. And David was a talented musician. He understood the power of music, the power to transform and heal. We just need to look at the Psalms and see that David had a song for every aspect of life, all human emotions, all aspects of our relationship with God. And here we see David use music to help him process his grief. David writes a lament in memory of Saul and Jonathan, David's dearest friend, and he orders that this song be taught to the people of Judah. Creating the song helps David express and process his loss and grief, and teaching it to others will keep the memory of Saul and Jonathan alive. Music can help us set the tone for our day, to process our emotions. And perhaps, like David, you may find yourself in a place of grief, or perhaps feeling lost, anxious, depressed. What songs might help you start the day positively, give you comfort and strength? The opening line of one of the most well-known psalms, Psalm 98, says, "Sing to the Lord a new song." We're compelled almost to seek new ways of expressing our love and our relationship with God. And because we don't just sing songs of lament, just as we don't just sing songs of thanks or adoration or celebration, our lives, just like David's, are roller coasters of emotions and experiences, shaping how we respond to the world around us. There is a time for everything, for death, for new life, for weeping, for crying, rejoicing, withdrawing, celebrating, and just being everyday normal. At this time in David's life, it was a time for mourning, even of his enemies. It's a very personal lament that he composes. God isn't actually mentioned in it at all, which is perhaps why the composition doesn't feature in the Psalms, but just here and in the now lost book of Jashar. David tells how a dignitary, Saul, represented by a gazelle, has been slain. And in sobering, somber words, he expresses his wish that Israel's enemies don't gloat about this tragic event. He curses the land which Saul and Jonathan died on. He extols Saul and Jonathan for their heroism, saying, "The bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. In life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted." And finally, he praises Saul's generosity and Jonathan's intimate friendship. We know that David and Jonathan were very close. He loved him like a brother. So it's not surprising that David mourns Jonathan. However, you wouldn't think that this song was written about a man who was trying to kill David. David's heart for both of these men is quite sincere and simply shows the greatness of his character and his ability to turn to God despite the emotional roller coaster he is experiencing. We can see this chapter in David's life as a great example to us in that we should turn to Jesus no matter how terrible the situation is, and where our emotions may run rampant and try to control us. David knew what sorrow was. And more than that, Jesus is called the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And because of this, we know we can turn to Jesus no matter what the situation, because he will know perfectly well what we are going through. But today we're thinking of what we can learn from David's example and how we should look for the best in people, hoping that that they will turn to God and repent from their sin. We must love our enemies as our friends until the day they die, trusting God for the best in their lives. And actually, that maybe sounds fairly easy enough, especially if it's a fairly passive love that we choose to show to our enemies, and that we don't actively go out of our way to confront them or engage with them. But in a world where conflict is an ever-present reality, is this actually realistic? On Remembrance Sunday, do we honour, remember, and pray not just for those who died defending our nations, but also those whom we fought against? Can you weep and mourn for the German soldier in the trench at Ypres, for the SS soldier on the beach at Normandy, for the Argentinian conscript in the Falkland Islands, for the Iraqi soldier in the desert near Baghdad? Or believe it or not, your parents, maybe, or grandparents or great-grandparents, perhaps did. Thousands of Germans who died in Britain during the First and Second World Wars were laid to rest in local graveyards. British people tended these graves for decades, even laying flowers and wreaths for their former foes. It was estimated that more than 7,000 German soldiers and prisoners of war were once buried in cemeteries near British towns and villages where they died. Memorial services were held for German soldiers who died in British hospitals. And coming out of the wars, people wanted to try and build a better future. And they saw that caring for the enemy's dead was a way to do this. The graves of the German war dead in Britain played a crucial role in restoring relations between the countries after the world wars. We can follow this example, seeking to be peacemakers, bringing about reconciliation, forgiveness. Like David, when hearing of King Saul's death, we often have two ways to respond to the misfortunes of those who oppose us. We can be happy or sad. We can celebrate or grieve for them. How do we respond when something good happens to us at the expense of another, such as the suffering of an enemy? How content are we to wait for God's perfect timing to let his plan play out? Will we react to all situations in a God-honouring way? How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished. Today's enemy may be tomorrow's friend. Our love for all people should value them as a person to be loved in times of friendship and of conflict. Despite Saul's rejection of him, David still loved him regardless. And that mirrors the unending, unfailing love that God has for us, no matter how many times we reject him. Learning from King David, we can see that suffering is a part of life. Things can go wrong, but how we react to the different times is what defines our relationship with one another and with God. We have all experienced hurt and suffering, joy, success. It's the honouring of God in all these situations that matters. At that evening with Rob Bell, when we exchanged these I know how you feel cards with one another, Rob said that at the beginning of the tour, he'd expected people to kind of look awkwardly at each other and give a little grimace of acknowledgement, like, you've done the same as me. But instead, he found that people were smiling, laughing, joking even. You're in mountains of debt like me too. Brilliant. My mother had treatment for cancer the same year as you, God rest her soul. You've had how many job interviews and still can't get a job? Well, I thought my 10 was kind of a record, but you've got some kind of achievement. You know, it sounds silly, but suddenly we didn't feel the suffering. Instead, we felt the love and comfort and assurance of a shared experience, the same that David knew throughout his ups and downs of life. We didn't know what the outcome would be, but we knew God was with us regardless. And out of the suffering could come something that was new and unexpected. To quote Rob Bell in his book, he says, we plot, we plan, we assume things are going to go a certain way, and when they don't, we find ourselves in a new place, a place we haven't been before, a place we would never have imagined on our own. It's the difficult and the unexpected, and maybe even the tragic, that opens us up and frees us to see things in new ways. Many of the most significant moments in our lives come not because it all went right, but because it all fell apart. Suffering does that. It hurts, but it also creates. There are endless opportunities in life to serve God, both in the good times and the bad. It's what we do with our lives that matters, not just calling out to God in times of pain, but knowing that he already has a plan for our lives, one that came at a painful cost to him, but which gives us life. So let's be the difference. Let's care for our enemies as well as our friends. Let's allow God's transforming love to reconcile hardened hearts. Let's remember all those who lost their lives in wars between nations that once were enemies and now are friends. Let's seek to create a new way to live in a world desperately in need of God's love.